Maurice Harold Macmillan, born on February 10, 1894, at 52 Cadogan Place in the affluent Belgravia district of London, entered the world as the youngest of three sons, preceded by brothers Daniel and Arthur, to Maurice Crawford Macmillan, a distinguished publisher who directed the renowned Macmillan and Company firm established by his Scottish grandfather Daniel Macmillan, a humble crofter from the Isle of Arran whose rags to riches ascent from bookseller to literary magnate allowed Harold to later invoke a proletarian heritage amid his elite milieu, and Helen Arty Tarleton Bells, a spirited American artist and socialite hailing from Spencer, Indiana, whose vibrant personality, artistic flair, and Midwestern roots brought a transatlantic dynamism to the household, often clashing with her husband's more staid British reserve in ways that fostered Harold's adaptability and cultural duality. From his earliest days, young Harold was immersed in a world of intellectual stimulation, surrounded by the literary treasures of the family business, which published luminaries like Rudyard Kipling, Thomas Hardy, and W.B. Yeats, fostering in him a lifelong love of books and a penchant for quoting classical literature in moments of crisis, such as reciting Aeschylus during wartime peril. Yet his childhood was not idyllic, marked by his mother's domineering influence that instilled a deep-seated shyness, emotional reticence, and vulnerability to depression, traits that biographers like D.R. Thorpe and Alastair Horn have linked to a repressive family dynamic where affection was rationed and expectations loomed large, leaving Harold with a lifelong mask of wit and unflappability to conceal inner turmoil. He often described himself as a gownsman, scholar, and swordsman, soldier, a self-image rooted in this blend of intellectual nurture and emotional austerity. The family's wealth ensured a cocoon of privilege, yet it was laced with the rigid social norms of Edwardian England, where empire and etiquette defined one's place, and Harold's early exposure to both British propriety and American boldness would shape his pragmatic, adaptable approach to politics, allowing him to navigate class divides with a unique blend of aristocratic poise and populist empathy, while his Scottish lineage provided a narrative thread he wove into speeches to appeal to working-class voters. Macmillan's formal education commenced at Mr. Gladstone's day school in Sloane Square from age 6 or 7, where he delved into classical Latin and Greek, supplemented by daily French lessons at home and physical training at Mr. Macpherson's gymnasium and dancing academy, laying the groundwork for his scholarly inclinations and linguistic prowess. He then progressed to Summerfield School in Oxford from 1903 to 1906, a preparatory institution known for grooming future elites with its rigorous curriculum and emphasis on character building, before securing a third scholarship to Eton College in 1906, where he boarded until 1910, excelling in classics and history but struggling with recurrent illnesses, including a near-fatal bout of pneumonia in his first term that forced prolonged absences and ultimately led to his early departure without completing his final year, a gap filled by private tutors like the influential Ronald Knox from 1910 to 1911, who deepened his high church Anglican faith and introduced him to theological debates that would inform his moral compass in politics. Despite these setbacks, Eton instilled in him a sense of duty, camaraderie among the aristocracy, and a network of lifelong connections, though rumors persisted, later explored by biographers Michael Bloch and D.R. Thorpe, of an expulsion related to homosexual activities, with Thorpe suggesting his mother intervened upon discovering he was being used by older boys. A scandalous whisper that Macmillan never publicly addressed but which may have contributed to his lifelong discretion in personal matters and aversion to public vulnerability. Winning an exhibition scholarship to Balliol College, Oxford, in 1912, he immersed himself in the great course of light ray humaniores, blending philosophy, ancient history, and politics, where he achieved a first in honor moderations in Latin and Greek by 1914. Joining debating societies like the Oxford Union, where he served as secretary and junior treasurer, positioning him for potential presidency had war not intervened, and absorbing an eclectic ideology that mixed moderate conservatism with liberal admiration for figures like Henry Campbell Bannerman and H. Asquith, whom he praised for their intellectual sincerity and moral nobility, and even Fabian socialism, influenced by Benjamin Disraeli's One Nation ethos and David Lloyd George's fiery 1913 Union speech on land reform, all while enjoying the halcyon days of Trinity term rowing, garden parties, and intellectual sparring before the cataclysm of World War I abruptly halted his studies on August 4, 1914, leaving him with an incomplete degree that he jokingly attributed to being sent down by the Kaiser, a quip underscoring the war's profound disruption to his generation's aspirations. The outbreak of World War I in August 1914 propelled Macmillan from academic pursuits into the grim reality of trench warfare, volunteering immediately and securing a commission as a temporary second lieutenant in the King's Royal Rifle Corps on November 19, 1914, before transferring to the elite Grenadier Guards on January 30, 1915, where he was promoted to lieutenant and shipped to the Western Front in August 1915, embodying the Edwardian ideal of patriotic sacrifice among the upper classes, who volunteered en masse. His service was marked by extraordinary bravery and grievous wounds. During the Battle of Loos on September 25 to 27, 1915, he sustained a gunshot to his right hand and a glancing head wound from a bullet, necessitating hospitalization in London and reserve duties at Chelsea Barracks until March 1916, only to return for the Somme Offensive's Battle of Flers-Courcelette on September 15, 1916, where leading an advance platoon, he was riddled with shrapnel in the pelvis, thigh, and knee, collapsing into a shell hole where he lay for over 12 hours, feigning death amid patrolling Germans, sustaining himself by reading Aeschylus's Prometheus Bound in Greek to maintain composure, and injecting himself with morphine to endure the agony, a poignant anecdote he later recounted in memoirs as a fusion of classical stoicism and modern horror. Evacuated after rescue by his men, he endured multiple surgeries at King Edward VII Hospital in London, spending the war's remainder on crutches with his hip wound taking 4 years to fully heal, resulting in a permanent limp, a weakened right-hand grip that affected his handwriting for life, and chronic pain that he bore stoically without complaint. Decorated with the Croix de Guerre from France and mentioned in dispatches for valor, Macmillan's experiences forged a deep disdain for the war's futility, survivor's guilt, especially after the death of his Balliol contemporary Raymond Asquith, son of Prime Minister H. Asquith, killed on the Somme that same month, and a profound empathy for the working classes, whom he saw as cannon fodder in the general's blunders, attitudes that would inform his progressive conservatism, anti-appeasement fervor in the 1930s, and lifelong contempt for politicians like Rab Butler and Harold Wilson who avoided frontline service in either World War. Post-armistice on November 11, 1918, he briefly commanded a Guards Reserve battalion during a minor mutiny at Chelsea Barracks in late 1918, where troops refused re-embarkation for France, averting crisis with calm leadership that prompted a War Office inquiry but earned him respect. In 1919, he served as aide-de-camp to Victor Cavendish, 9th Duke of Devonshire, Governor-General of Canada, his future father-in-law, immersing himself in colonial administration and transatlantic diplomacy before relinquishing his commission on April 1, 1920, retaining the honorary title, Captain Macmillan, into the 1930s, a martial legacy that distinguished him as the only British Prime Minister wounded in both World Wars, the second being a dramatic plane crash on February 22, 1943, in Gibraltar during his wartime ministerial role in North Africa, from which he emerged with minor injuries, quipping to aides about his 9 lives. Emerging from the war in 1918, Macmillan briefly rejoined the family publishing house, applying his editorial acumen to works like James Elroy Flecker's poetry and fostering relationships with authors such as John Maynard Keynes, whose economic ideas would influence his later policies, but his true calling lay in public service, inspired by Disraeli's One Nation, Toryism and a desire to heal the social rifts exposed by the conflict, viewing politics as a moral imperative to prevent another war through social justice. His engagement to Lady Dorothy Evelyn Cavendish, the lively daughter of the 9th Duke of Devonshire, descended from the 4th Duke of Devonshire, a former Prime Minister, was announced on January 7, 1920, and they married on April 21, 1920, at St. Margaret's, Westminster, in a match that combined genuine affection with social advancement. Her Chatsworth lineage bolstering his status among the aristocracy, yet it was tainted from the outset by underlying strains, erupting in 1929 when Dorothy began a lifelong affair with the charismatic Conservative MP Robert Boothby, a bisexual bon vivant whose relationship with her scandalized high society but remained private until whispers in the 1950s. The affair produced a daughter, Sarah, born August 5, 1930, and who battled alcoholism before her death in 1970, widely believed to be Boothby's biologically. A betrayal Macmillan endured with silent dignity after advice from solicitor Philip Frere that divorce would ruin his career, leading to separate private lives and possibly contributing to his nervous breakdown in 1931, where he confided in diaries his anguish as a quiet bleeding of the heart, channeling heartbreak into political ambition rather than confrontation. The couple had 3 other children: Maurice Victor Macmillan, born January 27, 1921, who later became a Conservative MP, and Viscount Macmillan of Ovenden, dying in 1984, Lady Caroline Faber, born August 28, 1923, who married into the aristocracy and lived until 2016, and Catherine Macmillan, born November 19, 1926, who married into the Amory family and died in 1991. Despite the humiliation, Macmillan was often treated condescendingly by his in-laws at Chatsworth, hardening his resolve and fueling his independent streak in politics. Entering politics, he contested Stockton-on-Tees in the December 1923 general election as a Conservative, losing narrowly by 73 votes amid the Liberal resurgence, but triumphed in November 1924 amid the Zinoviev letter scandal that discredited Labour, representing the industrial Teesside constituency until 1929, where he championed the unemployed shipyard workers, drawing on wartime observations to advocate tariff protections, unemployment insurance reforms, and social housing in his maiden speech on March 30, 1925, positioning himself as a progressive, wet Tory critical of laissez-faire economics and Baldwin's government. Defeated in the May 1929 Labour landslide triggered by the Wall Street crash, he spent 2 years in opposition, authoring Reconstruction, a plea for a national policy in 1933, a forward-thinking manifesto advocating state intervention in industry, housing, and agriculture to combat depression, presaging Keynesian economics and earning him a reputation as an intellectual maverick. Regaining Stockton in October 1931's national government rout with a 10,000-vote majority, he joined the Ginger group of reformist MPs, co-authoring the next 5 years in 1935 to push for rearmament, economic planning, and imperial preference, while briefly resigning the party whip in 1936 over the government's weak response to Italy's invasion of Abyssinia, his vocal opposition to appeasement, condemning the December 1935 Horleval Pact that ceded Ethiopian territory and the September 1938 Munich Agreement with eloquent fury, quoting Shakespeare in Parliament as a tragedy of errors, isolated him from Chamberlain's inner circle, branding him a dissident but burnishing his integrity for the impending war, as he warned in his 1938 book The Middle Way of Fascism's economic allure and the need for a planned democracy to counter it. As storm clouds gathered over Europe, Macmillan's anti-appeasement stance positioned him for wartime responsibility when Winston Churchill ascended on May 10, 1940, appointing him parliamentary secretary to the Ministry of Supply on May 15, 1940, where he coordinated munitions production amid the Blitz, leveraging his publishing-honed organizational skills to streamline factories, negotiate with industrialists like Lord Beaverbrook, and boost output of tanks and aircraft, a role that honed his administrative prowess and earned Churchill's notice. Promoted to Under-Secretary of State for the Colonies on February 4, 1942, he grappled with imperial administration during global upheaval, advocating for colonial self-government in speeches that foreshadowed decolonization, but his breakthrough came on December 30, 1942, as resident minister at Allied Forces headquarters in Algiers, Churchill's personal envoy to the Mediterranean theater, where he navigated the fractious egos of generals like Harold Alexander, Mark Clark, and Bernard Montgomery, mediated between Free French leader Charles de Gaulle's intransigence, whom he described as a mixture of Joan of Arc and Clemenceau, and American pragmatism under Franklin D. Roosevelt, and forged a pivotal friendship with Dwight D. Eisenhower over shared whiskeys and strategic discussions, laying the groundwork for post-war Anglo-American alliances. His diplomatic finesse shone during the July 1943 invasion of Sicily, Operation Husky, and the September 1943 invasion of Italy, stabilizing liberated regions amid political chaos by establishing Allied military governments and negotiating with Italian partisans. He survived a dramatic plane crash on February 22, 1943, Near Algiers when his Liberator bomber caught fire on takeoff, escaping with burns and bruises, an incident he downplayed with humor but which underscored his resilience amid wartime perils. Later, as minister resident in the Mediterranean from May 1944, he influenced Greek policy during the Civil War's onset in December 1944, backing the monarchy against communists with British troops, a decision criticized as interventionist but reflective of his emerging Cold War foresight in containing Soviet influence. His wartime diaries, later published, detailed these intrigues, including tense meetings with Tito in Yugoslavia and de Gaulle in Paris. Briefly serving as Secretary of State for Air from May 4 to July 26, 1945, in Churchill's caretaker government, Macmillan faced electoral defeat in July's Labour triumph, losing Stockton by 8,000 votes but swiftly winning a by-election in Bromley on November 14, 1945, entering opposition with a memoir, The Blast of War, 1967, that romanticized his wartime exploits as a grand hotel of intrigue, complete with anecdotes like dining with Eisenhower under V-1 rocket threats, though privately he mourned the human toll, visiting bombed-out constituencies to connect with civilian suffering and drawing lessons for post-war reconstruction. The post-war era from 1945 to 1951 saw Macmillan as a key architect of conservative revival, critiquing Clement Attlee's socialist nationalizations of coal, steel, and railways while proposing moderate alternatives like worker participation in industry through co-ownership schemes, drawing on his Stockton experiences to advocate full employment, welfare expansions, and a mixed economy as safeguards against 1930s-style despair, co-authoring pamphlets like the Industrial Charter in May 1947 that committed the party to accepting the welfare state and nationalized industries in principle, a pragmatic shift that helped modernize conservatism. Churchill's October 1951 victory rewarded him with the Ministry of Housing and Local Government on October 30, 1951, where he tackled the post-war housing crisis with zeal, surpassing the ambitious target of 300,000 new homes annually by 1953, achieving 318,779 in that year alone, through innovative prefabrication techniques like airy houses, deregulation of building controls, incentives for private developers, and public-private partnerships, earning the moniker Housing Czar and headlines like Mac the Builder in the press. Though critics noted the emphasis on quantity over quality led to some substandard estates prone to dampness and structural issues, and environmentalists later decried the urban sprawl it encouraged. Elevated to Minister of Defense on October 19, 1954, he oversaw military restructuring amid decolonization and nuclear buildup, advocating a minimum deterrent strategy by canceling vulnerable projects like the Blue Streak missile in April 1960, post-tenure, and navigating inter-service rivalries over budget cuts. His brief tenure as Foreign Secretary from April 7 to December 20, 1955, involved the July 1955 Geneva summit's tentative détente with the Soviets, where he impressed with his unflappable demeanor amid Nikita Khrushchev's bombast and table-thumping, pushing for disarmament talks that laid groundwork for later treaties. As Chancellor of the Exchequer from December 20, 1955, Macmillan introduced premium bonds on April 10, 1956, a lottery-based savings scheme that raised billions without interest payments, appealing to the public's gambling instinct and becoming a cultural staple, and pursued expansionary policies to fuel growth through tax cuts and export drives, but clashed with fiscal conservatives like Peter Thornycroft, whose January 6, 1958, resignation over uncontrolled spending Macmillan backed the Treasury against, paving his path to leadership amid economic turbulence and the post-Suez fallout. The Suez Crisis of 1956 to 1957, a watershed of imperial decline, thrust Macmillan into the premiership through a mix of circumstance and cunning, initially supportive as Chancellor of Anthony Eden's covert collusion with France and Israel to seize the canal after Gamal Abdel Nasser's July 26, 1956, nationalization. He grew alarmed at the economic fallout from American opposition, warning Cabinet on November 6, 1956, of sterling's collapse under U.S. financial pressure via IMF loan denials and oil embargoes, urging withdrawal as reserves hemorrhaged, a pivot that preserved his viability when Eden resigned on January 9, 1957, citing health but reeling from the debacle's humiliation. Elected conservative leader unopposed on January 22, 1957, Macmillan assumed office at 63, reassuring a rattled nation in his first broadcast on January 10 that calm is returning, and swiftly mending fences with Eisenhower through personal diplomacy at the March 1957 Bermuda Conference. Domestically, his early years heralded the affluent society, with full employment, rising wages, and consumer booms, televisions, cars, and washing machines proliferating via hire purchase schemes, with GDP growth averaging 2.8% annually, culminating in his iconic July 20, 1957, Bedford speech. "Let us be frank about it, most of our people have never had it so good. Go around the country, go to the industrial towns, go to the farms and you will see a state of prosperity such as we have never had in my lifetime, nor indeed in the history of this country," a phrase capturing post-war optimism but later mocked as complacent amid persistent inequality and regional disparities. Key policies included the July 1957 Rent Act deregulating tenancies to spur private investment, the December 1956 Clean Air Act combating smog after the December 1952 Great Smog's 4,000 to 12,000 deaths by establishing smoke control areas, and investments in infrastructure like the M1 motorways opening on November 2, 1959, and nuclear power stations under the October 1956 Calder Hall model, the world's first commercial nuclear reactor. However, stop-go economics, alternating stimulus and austerity, led to overheating, with the July 1961 pay pause, freezing wages for 6 months to curb 4% inflation, alienating unions like the TUC and eroding the post-war consensus, while unemployment crept to 800,000 by 1962, betraying his "never again" pledge against interwar misery, and the October 1957 Windscale fire. Britain's worst nuclear accident, releasing radioactive iodine, was hushed up under his watch, with cabinet papers later revealing minimized health risks to avoid public panic. Triumphing in the October 8, 1959, general election with a 100-seat majority on slogans like "Life's better with the Conservatives, don't let Labour ruin it," Macmillan, satirized as Supermac by Evening Standard cartoonist Vicky since 1958, embodied paternalistic stability, but cracks emerged as the swinging 60s challenged his Edwardian ethos. The 1957 Wolfenden Report's recommendations on decriminalizing homosexuality led to tentative reforms, though not enacted until the July 1967 Sexual Offences Act post his tenure, while Commonwealth immigration surged under the 1948 British Nationality Act, prompting the June 1962 Commonwealth Immigrants Act's work voucher restrictions amid racial tensions, with Macmillan suppressing Enoch Powell's inflammatory warnings in cabinet to maintain harmony, though Notting Hill riots in 1958 exposed underlying prejudices. Foreign policy was his forte, rebuilding the special relationship with Eisenhower via the March 1957 Bermuda Conference's nuclear sharing accords under the 1958 US-UK Mutual Defense Agreement, and mentoring John F. Kennedy, whose sister Kathleen had married Dorothy's nephew William Cavendish in 1944, like a wayward nephew, during White House visits. Coordinating during the August 1961 Berlin crisis and October 1962 Cuban Missile standoff from Chequers, where he advocated restraint to avert nuclear war. His February 3, 1960, Wind of Change address in Cape Town's apartheid parliament, declaring, "The wind of change is blowing through this continent. Whether we like it or not, this growth of national consciousness is a political fact," and quoting Lord Macaulay on liberty, "If men are to wait for liberty until they become wise and good in slavery, they may indeed wait forever." Accelerated decolonization, granting independence to Nigeria on October 1, 1960, Sierra Leone on April 27, 1961, Tanganyika on December 9, 1961, and over a dozen others by 1964, justified by economic audits showing colonies' £100 million annual drain, though critics like Lord Salisbury decried it as too clever by half, alienating imperial diehards and white settlers in Rhodesia and Kenya. Macmillan's European vision drove the creation of the European Free Trade Association, EFTA, on May 3, 1960, as an alternative to the EEC, but he pivoted to applying for EEC membership on July 31, 1961, negotiating tirelessly against backbench opposition from 60 anti-marketeers and Beaverbrook press attacks labeling it a betrayal, only to suffer Charles de Gaulle's veto on January 14, 1963, announced January 29, who viewed Britain as America's Trojan horse in Europe, a blow Macmillan lamented in his diary as shattering his grand design and exacerbating domestic unrest. Nuclear triumphs mitigated setbacks. Canceling Blue Streak for vulnerability in April 1960, he secured Skybolt missiles from the U.S. in 1960, but when cancelled in November 1962, he clinched the December 21, 1962, Nassau Agreement for Polaris submarines after tense Bahamas talks with Kennedy, sustaining Britain's independent deterrent despite de Gaulle's fury and Labour's opposition. The August 5, 1963, Partial Test Ban Treaty, signed in Moscow after Lord Hailsham's July negotiations amid sweltering heat, banned atmospheric, underwater, and space nuclear tests, a diplomatic coup amid Cold War thaw hailed by Macmillan as a first step towards peace, though the September 1963 Indonesian confrontation, sparked by Sukarno's threats to gobble Malaysia raw, after the September 16 embassy burnings in Jakarta, saw Macmillan appealing to Australia's Robert Menzies for troops, a low-level conflict involving British forces that outlasted his tenure. Domestically, scandals eroded his aura. The October 1962 Vassall spy case, where Admiralty clerk John Vassall was convicted of espionage for the Soviets, exposed security flaws and led to tribunals criticizing government laxity, while the Profumo affair, War Secretary John Profumo's liaison with 19-year-old showgirl Christine Keeler, who simultaneously bedded Soviet naval attaché Yevgeny Ivanov, exploded in March 1963 after MP George Wigg's tip to Labour leader Harold Wilson, with Profumo's March 22 denial in Parliament. There was no impropriety whatsoever, unraveling into his June 5 resignation for perjury, prompting Nigel Birch's damning Commons quote from Browning, "Never glad confident morning again," and satirical barbs from Private Eye and BBC's That Was the Week that was portraying Macmillan as an out-of-touch relic, with his June 18 statement admitting he had been grossly negligent in not probing deeper fueling calls for his ouster. The July 13, 1962, Night of the Long Knives, sacking 7 ministers including Chancellor Selwyn Lloyd in a ruthless reshuffle, representing a third of the cabinet, in a bid to inject youth like Reginald Maudling and inject vigor, aimed to rejuvenate but backfired, depicting him as despotic and weakening party unity, with sacked ministers like Lloyd feeling betrayed and leaking resentments to the press, fueling internal dissent amid polls showing Labour leads. By 1963, economic stagnation, with 5% inflation, trade deficits, and the harsh, beaching axe, railway closures announced March 27, 1963, compounding the malaise, leading to his prostate surgery on October 10, 1963, and resignation on October 18, 1963, at 69, ostensibly for health but amid exhaustion from the modern world, and party intrigue that saw Alec Douglas Home succeed him after a contentious election. In retirement at Birch Grove Estate in Sussex, elevated to the Order of Merit in 1963 and to Earl of Stockton on February 10, 1984, despite Margaret Thatcher's reluctance over his One Nation welfarism, he authored a 6-volume memoir series, Winds of Change, 1966, The Blast of War, 1967, Tides of Fortune, 1969, Riding the Storm, 1971, Pointing the Way, 1972, and At the End of the Day, 1973, blending self-justification with wry anecdotes, dissecting Suez as Eden's folly, de Gaulle's veto as continental caprice, and critiquing Thatcher's monetarism as harsh in his maiden Lord's speech on November 7, 1984, famously likening privatization to selling the family silver. He advocated Rhodesia's transition to Zimbabwe in 1980 debates, supported anti-apartheid measures, and enjoyed family life, doting on grandchildren despite Sarah's tragic alcoholism and early death. Dorothy's death from a heart attack on May 21, 1966, ended their strained union, marked by her Boothby affair and his stoic endurance. Macmillan passed away on December 29, 1986, at 92, from pneumonia at Birch Grove, his funeral at St. Giles Church, Horst Keynes, on January 5, 1987, uniting Thatcher, Ronald Reagan's envoy, and Mikhail Gorbachev's representative, cementing his legacy as decolonization's midwife, affluence's herald, and a bridge from empire to Europe, though critics note his role in accelerating imperial retreat without adequate safeguards for minorities. The mistakes that led to Macmillan's downfall were a confluence of strategic misjudgments, personal frailties, and an inability to adapt to accelerating social change, culminating in a premiership that began in triumph but ended in ignominy. Chief among them was his mishandling of the Profumo affair, where his initial dismissal of rumors as gutter press sensationalism in March 1963 allowed the scandal to fester for months, revealing a patrician naivety about sexual mores in the permissive 60s and lax oversight of ministers, eroding public faith in governmental integrity as the affair's espionage undertones dominated headlines and led to his admission of negligence in June. Economically, his stop-go policies, pursuing growth through tax cuts and spending only to impose harsh restraints like the July 1961 pay pause and 1962 credit squeeze, fostered instability, alienating labor and business alike without resolving chronic balance of payments issues. A failure to heed earlier warnings from Thornycroft in 1958 that left Britain vulnerable to devaluation pressures post-resignation in 1967. The Night of the Long Knives exemplified hubris, alienating loyalists and projecting instability rather than renewal, with sacked ministers like Lloyd feeling betrayed, fueling internal dissent and poor poll ratings. His EEC bid, while prescient, underestimated de Gaulle's nationalism, investing political capital in 18 months of negotiations doomed by the January 1963 French veto, isolating Britain and emboldening Eurosceptics within his party. Health neglect, aggravated by heavy smoking, up to 50 cigarettes a day, and delayed medical attention for his prostate issues, hastened his exit, but deeper was his Edwardian reticence, ill-suited to confronting personal scandals or the youth-driven cultural shift epitomized by the Beatles and Profumo's fallout, allowing satire to paint him as obsolete. Ultimately, these errors reflected a leader anchored in pre-war values, unable to fully grasp the winds of change he himself unleashed. Transforming, never had it so good, into a premature twilight.